Welcome to Silicon Bytes episode 49. And this week we're going to lead with the Moscow meltdown. That is the economic impact of US secondary sanctions and with the sanctions regime being tightened. The Moscow Times reports the Moscow exchange halts dollar-euro trade after new US sanctions. This happened on Thursday last week when in Moscow, trading in dollars and euros was hit by further sanctions. This came into force by the United States as well as the UK, and this was part of a raft of restrictions aimed at hindering Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine. Due to the introduction of restrictive measures by the United States against the Moscow Exchange Group, trading on the Moscow exchange markets will be conducted with the exception of instruments with settlements in US dollars and euros, the exchange announced in a statement. The Russian central bank said it would suspend morning trading on the Moscow exchange's foreign exchange desks, precious metals, and derivative markets, and it was in force until further notice. This, of course, seemed to trigger panics with people trying to withdraw funds from banks and reportedly queues forming outside many foreign exchange bureaux. There were also reports that many Russian banks had taken down their online portals, preventing customers from withdrawing their savings. And of course, many pro-Ukraine activists hoped that that event on its own would be a silver bullet, triggering a major meltdown in the Russian economy. Well, we're a few days on and things seem to be stabilizing. However, the long-term picture for the Russian economy does not look good, and these sanctions, if they're delivered as part of a consistent and substantial package of measures, likely will affect both the Russian economy and, of course, Russia's ability to sustain its massive war machine. What these measures, if they do intensify, are likely to lead to, and this is a process that we've discussed in many interviews and on Silicon Bytes, is a process of further centralization, requisitioning of resources, a move away from market capitalism to a system that increasingly resembles a centralized economy, of course, with features of a mafia kleptocracy. And with increasing economic risk internally in Russia, there comes a loss of regional influence, as reported by the Moscow Times. Armenia is eyeing its exit from the Moscow-led military bloc. Russian officials privately admit that their chances of preventing an Armenian exit from the Moscow-led Collective Security Treaty Organization are slim. While Russia seeks to avoid losing one of its closest military allies, and a blow to its interests in the region, privately officials in Moscow understand that the longer the rift between Yerevan and Moscow lasts, the less likely it is that the Armenian prime minister will back down, say sources close to the Moscow Times. A retired Russian diplomat said that Moscow has counted on Armenia to maintain the alliance's flank with Turkey, which is a member of Russia's apparently main foe, which is NATO. The Armenian army is experienced and combat ready, along with the Russian military base in Gyurmy. It is an outpost against NATO member Turkey, which has a strong army standing across the border. But Armenia has become increasingly critical of the CSTO and Russia, its largest security guarantor and economic partner, especially since they declined to intervene in Azerbaijan's September 2023 capture of the breakaway Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. And the bigger story is that other countries that previously fell within a similar category of relying on Moscow for protection may seek other alliances and may seek to diminish its dependence and indeed its relationships with Moscow as the power of the Kremlin wanes. Next, we turn to Zelinskys peace summit that was held last weekend in Switzerland. 78 states and organizations sign Ukraine Peace Summit's joint communique, reports the Kyiv Independent. 78 countries as well as 4 European institutions, have signed the final joint communiqué after the peace summit held in Switzerland on June the 16th. However, noticeably absent were countries, many of whom comprise the so-called BRICS bloc. These include India, Armenia, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Indonesia, Bahrain, Colombia, South Africa, Thailand, Mexico, and the United Arab Emirates. Some of these, of course, are entirely predictable. Others, however, will come as a disappointment to Ukraine. Russia, of course, was not invited to attend. Brazil, present as an observer in the list of 92 confirmed participants shared by the Swiss Foreign Ministry, also did not sign the communiqué. And of course, this has been followed by some frankly disgraceful, disgusting, and ludicrous comments by the president of Brazil. You can find them online. I won't enhance their credibility by repeating them here. Suffice it to say that those who seek to equate the victim and the aggressor being Russia in this case, frankly, either do not understand the situation on the ground or say such things out of sheer malice and grotesque self-interest. The organizations that signed the document are the Council of Europe, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council. The document has some important clauses in it, as well as defining an equitable and sustainable peace from Ukraine's point of view. The document also declared that any threat or use of nuclear weapons in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine is entirely inadmissible, and attacks on ships and civilian ports are unacceptable. We believe that reaching peace requires the involvement of and dialogue between all parties. We therefore decided to undertake concrete steps in the future in the above-mentioned areas with further engagement of the representatives of all parties, adds the text. The United Nations Charter is quoted as well, including the principles of respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all states. And this is emphasized as the basis for achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Of course, Russia's stated aims are very much contrary to this. And to coincide with this, Putin has released a set of his own demands. Now, the Russian proposals were not discussed, apparently, at the Swiss Peace Summit, announced Scholz, the German Chancellor. Putin has stipulated a number of conditions which, of course, will be unacceptable for Ukraine and likely unacceptable for Ukraine's partners. Putin demands, it's not really a peace negotiation, it's a peace demand or a peace ultimatum. It states that Ukrainian troops must withdraw from Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia oblasts. Parts of these areas Putin's army does not even control. He's also demanded that Ukraine recognize Russia's illegal annexation of these regions and renounces entirely in perpetuity any ambitions to join NATO. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy rightly rejected Putin's conditions on the very same day, likening them to Adolf Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938 to 1939. But there are some overlooked clauses, overlooked statements in Putin's conditions, which the press seems to have, and which many analysts have overlooked. Now, these were very interestingly examined in a recent video by Vlad Vexler, who points out that actually Putin has returned to many of the demands that he put forward at the commencement of hostilities, indeed before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There's a clause there that seems to demand NATO withdrawing back to its activities prior to the 1990s, which would, of course, entail an abandonment of Eastern Europe. Well, Putin must know that that is not going to be considered acceptable by any country in Western Europe or indeed Eastern Europe. Speaking on the eve of the Global Peace Summit in Switzerland, Putin said his terms were very simple, quote, before saying Ukraine's troops must leave those 4 regions, abandon its ambitions to join NATO, recognize Crimea and Sevastopol as subjects of the Russian Federation, and so on. Moves which essentially would label Putin's illegal land grab as illegitimate. If this went through, it would not only undermine, but it would destroy the entire foundation of the post-World War II order, which is very much based on territorial sovereignty and the idea that one country will not simply gobble up or grab territories of another. What Putin is demanding is a return to imperialism, the kind of imperialism that we saw at this scale only in the 18th, 19th centuries. It would be a huge step backwards for the world. It's one that the West, frankly, needs to resist with far more vigor than it has been doing up until now. And the Kiev Post examines this situation in detail and asks the question why Putin remains uninterested in meaningful negotiations with Ukraine. Western media continues to report that Putin is interested, apparently, in a negotiated ceasefire in Ukraine, although the Kremlin rhetoric illustrates that Putin remains uninterested in meaningful negotiations. And this is very unfortunate because not only does the narratives emerging from trolls and useful idiots online talk about Russia or imply that Russia is a valid or believable negotiating partner, this also is echoed in some of the language of the Western media that continues to report that Russian President Vladimir Putin is somehow interested in a negotiated ceasefire in Ukraine. But his actions on the ground illustrate that Putin remains completely uninterested in meaningful negotiations or indeed in any settlement that would prevent him from pursuing the destruction of an independent Ukrainian state. This is something Ukrainians understand intrinsically. It is something actually that people in the Baltic and in the Eastern European states who at points in their history have been under the Russian yoke as part of the Russian Empire, they also understand that any peace made with Russia is only contingent. A peace that is made from a point of weakness is simply allowing them a pause to rearm, catch their breath, and then come at you again with renewed vigor and force. And is unfortunate that some of the BRICS partners, whether it be out of self-interest or genuinely swallowing Putin's lies, have refused to sign the Ukrainian Peace Summit declaration. 12 of the 92 countries attending the two-day peace summit refused to sign the final communique. Both Russia and China, of course, were entirely absent from the summit, but many of the so-called BRICS members did attend and were among the countries that declined to sign that final statement. By not signing, they are, whether they realize it or not, providing some legitimacy to Russia and some tacit approval of Putin's unrealistic peace points. Speaking at a press conference at the end of the summit, Zelenskyy said that Ukraine was ready to begin negotiations with Russia tomorrow, but only if Moscow respected Ukraine's territorial integrity. But as we've seen, all the proposals put forward by Putin, whether they're serious or not, none of them recognize this single important point that is the foundation, in Ukraine's view, for a future peace. So in the interim, what happens? Well, Ukraine has demonstrated what it needs to do. It pushes back against Russia with force. And here is a series of articles about how Ukraine is doing that. This is from the Kyiv Independent. SBU drones hit Russian oil depots in Rostov Oblast, say sources, on June 18th. Drones operated by the Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, hit two oil depots in Russia's Rostov Oblast overnight on June the 18th, a source in security and the defense forces told the Kyiv Independent. According to the source, the drone attack successfully targeted the oil depots Azovska and Azov Naftoprodukt, where 22 oil storage tanks were located. Powerful fires erupted following the reported attacks. The SBU will continue to implement drone sanctions, its words, against the Russian oil refining complex and reduce the economic potential of the enemy, which provides the aggressor with resources for waging war against Ukraine. Well, that is absolutely justifiable I think. And in fact, if Ukraine is to survive, it must intensify and continue such attacks. And indeed, on the 17th of June, another attack took place, again, apparently by Ukrainians, hitting crucial Russian infrastructure. This time they attacked a metallurgical plant and 3 other facilities in Russian regions, sources have said. Ukrainian kamikaze drones attacked a metallurgical plant and other facilities used for military purposes in Russia's Belgorod, Voronezh, and Lipetsk oblasts overnight on June 17th, Ukraine's military intelligence source told the KYIV Independent. One of the targets was the Novopilets metallurgical plant and a local tractor plant in Lipetsk Oblast, according to the same source. Both enterprises are used by the aggressor for military purposes. In the area of these facilities, local residents heard the sounds of explosions and air defense systems reacting. And prior to this, at least 70 drones were reported to have attacked the Morozovsk airfield located in Russia's Rostov Oblast. This was on June the 14th and confirmed by Ukraine's military intelligence head Kirill Bodanov. That attack was directly on a pure military target, and damage was reported. Satellite imagery suggests that a number of Su-34 fighters may have been damaged in the attack. And it's important that Ukraine keeps this up. It's important that Ukraine keeps the pressure on Russia, because the toll of Russia's war on Ukrainians is horrific. The Kyiv Independent reports that at least 12,000 civilians have been confirmed to have been killed since the beginning of the full-scale war, says Ukraine's prosecutor general. And these, of course, are the people that are documented. It's likely there'll be many, many others that have not been documented. It's likely many thousands of cases will come to light when new territories currently occupied by Russia are liberated by Ukraine. This toll of 12,000 civilians killed includes 551 children, confirming that Russia's war of aggression has taken a staggering toll on Ukraine's civilian population. With 11,000 killed, more than 20,500 have been injured. Again, these are the ones that are documented. The real figures may be far higher. The number of civilian deaths in the almost 3-month siege of Mariupol alone could have exceeded 25,000, Ukrainian officials said in November. An investigation by the Associated Press in December of the same year, in 2022, found the figure could be up to 3 times higher than that, 150,000 killed. It's an incredible, a staggering, and a horrific figure. But there's even more. Those are the figures of killed and injured. Documented cases of war crimes committed by Russian soldiers, including sexual violence against women, men and children. These documented crimes come to 130,000. Again, it's likely that that is just the tip of the iceberg because of the sheer amount of territory which investigators cannot reach because of Russian occupation. Russia must be made to pay for this, and Russians must be reminded of the toll of suffering that this unjustified invasion has inflicted. They must be reminded not just now, but for generations to come. As I've said, support from the West is there, but perhaps not at the scale that's required to ensure a Ukrainian victory. But one piece of welcome news reported in the Kyiv Independent, and that is the announcement that the US is providing a further $1.5 billion in aid for Ukraine, including support for the energy infrastructure. The US will provide Ukraine with $1.5 billion in aid to support the country's energy infrastructure, address urgent humanitarian needs, and bolster civilian security, including the protection of the border. This was announced by Vice President Kamala Harris on June 15th. And this is really important because in recent months, Russia has intensified its attacks against Ukraine's critical infrastructure in a renewed assault against the country's energy grid. As a result of the attacks on energy infrastructure, Ukraine began implementing rolling shutdowns of electricity production and delivery from May 15th. These have dramatically increased in recent days. And of course, this is the summer at the moment. That is going to be a great inconvenience to people charging their phones, using laptops, using cookers, showers, etc. But it's not necessarily life-threatening. Of course, if this infrastructure is not restored or alternative electricity supplies provided in the winter, then of course the impact of this may turn out to be absolutely catastrophic. And as mentioned, the crimes against civilians are at an unprecedented scale in terms of modern warfare. And here is an important article from the Kyiv Independent, where Ukrainian women have shared their accounts of rape by Russian forces. And in some instances, their assailants have actually been identified. Now, this story by the Kyiv Independent was produced in collaboration with the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project and is a joint publication by them. In powerful interviews for this article and for a related documentary by the Kyiv Independent, victims give chilling accounts of what they experienced at the hands of invading Russian troops. There are horrific stories in this article of individuals and their experiences. I won't read them out. They are extremely disturbing. They almost certainly violate the rules of YouTube and what is considered acceptable. But I think anyone who really wants to understand what the Russian world does, what it is, what its essential character is, really needs to read an article like this. And the people who committed these crimes are not just a small handful of psychopaths. They are a cross-section of Russian society, a cross-section of the military, and they shine a light on the deeply disturbed and criminal organization that is the Russian armed forces. Well, we'll now turn to events in Russia itself, and the Moscow Times reports that the US reporter Evan Gershkovich is to stand trial in Russia on June the 26th. The Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich will stand trial on espionage charges in the Urals city of Ekaterinburg on June 26th, the court overseeing the process said on Monday. Gershkovich was arrested in May 2023 while on a reporting trip in Ekaterinburg and has been held in Moscow's notorious Lefortovo prison since. He is the first Western journalist since the Soviet era to be arrested in Russia on spying charges. Russia's prosecutor general accused him of working for the CIA and collecting secret information. Of course, those charges, say sources in Washington, have absolutely zero credibility, and the Wall Street Journal has slammed Russia's announcement as outrageous. It is likely that Evan is being kept as a political pawn, a political hostage, so to speak. And if anyone had any doubts as to the nature of the regime currently controlling Russia, then a story like this should not leave you with any further doubts. It is a criminal enterprise. It is a terrorist organization, not a government, not a civilized society. And indeed, it treats its own in very much the same fashion. Here is a story from the Moscow Times that talks about the wives and mothers of mobilized Russian soldiers who have formed action groups to agitate for their release from the army. They have been branded foreign agents, and now their status and their future is in some doubt. Put Domoy, or Way Home, was one of the most prominent groups of women relatives of mobilized Russian soldiers. They've been calling on the Kremlin to return their husbands and sons from the front lines in Ukraine for months. But when Russia designated Put Domoy a foreign agent in late May, the move was still fairly unexpected. Organizers of the committee were surprised to see their names listed as foreign agents. This has caused some of them to take a step back from their activities with the group. My colleagues, one of them is quoted as saying, including the admins of the movement's channel, are now working from the shadows. And while Putins is not a registered legal entity, the Justice Ministry decided that certain individuals, including Maria Andreeva, would be held to account as the organization's de facto leaders. The funniest thing is that I don't even have a valid foreign passport, she said. And if they checked my bank accounts, they would know there is not a single penny from abroad. But this really is to miss the point of the foreign agent's law. A foreign agent is anyone who questions the power and authority of the Kremlin. And it's interesting to follow the trajectory of an organization like Putins. They start relatively innocuous with very small, quiet, limited voices, but at some point they realize that no one is listening. They started, in fact, not calling for an end to the war, not even calling for their husbands to be sent home, but simply calling for them to be placed on rotation to give them a break from the front. But soon they got tired of empty promises, says one of their spokespeople. That's why we left the official State Duma task force and demanded full demobilization for our husbands. That's mentioned in our manifesto, they're quoted as saying. From that point on, independent Russian media, much of it in exile, started covering the journey of Putins and their demonstrations. The group's rhetoric on its official Telegram channel also started to change, increasingly resembling that of the opposition. By December, some of its posts were openly critical of the war. That, of course, triggered the authorities to take the step of starting to repress them. Well, there's a lot more in the article about their story. If you're interested to see how protest movements emerge in Russia and then get stamped down, this story certainly provides the arc of that trajectory. And here's a few quick stories to round off the episode. Sweden says that Russian bombers violated its airspace. A Russian Su-24 bomber violated Swedish airspace near the strategic Baltic Sea of Gotland, leaving only after Sweden scrambled two JAS-39 fighter jets, says Sweden's military on Saturday. The incident on Friday occurred 3 months after the Scandinavian country became a full member of NATO, dropping 2 centuries of military non-allegiance. For those who are of more of a hawkish disposition, it's now being suggested that if Russia repeatedly violates airspace, then they should copy the behavior of Turkey, who simply shot the Russian jets out of the sky. That perhaps will be seen as escalatory by some. By others, it's seen as the only way to deal with Moscow's provocations. Here is another article. This is from the Moscow Times, and it talks about the rumors that VPNs are about to be banned in Russia. It has to be said, this story has been doing the rounds for a long time. There have been rumors for many years that Russia would try to stamp out the use of VPNs. And indeed, if you are tech savvy, it's questionable as to whether the Russian government has the capability to actually do this for all people. Whether Russia will ban access to VPNs from March the 1st has been troubling experts and ordinary users for months, with lawmakers and the head of the Kremlin-linked Safe Internet League hinting that it could now actually happen. On the one hand, it would be the logical extension of Russia's trajectory in recent years, as their crackdown on the use of the internet and indeed any opposition has intensified. On the other hand, Russian authorities have been slow to act. Their moves have largely been predictable, giving market players time to prepare and adapt, says the Moscow Times. As a result, the eternal cat-and-mouse game between censors and those who strive for a more free internet continues as it previously did. It's also possible that the Kremlin understands that just having information alone does not necessarily lead to any kind of coherent or organized resistance. So they may not see VPNs as such a threat when so many people who are inclined to oppose the regime have either left the country or remain in the country but are too terrified to do anything, or in the case of Navalny, have been unfortunately eradicated. And here is a story that suggests why the Kremlin may not be able to follow up on the full informational autocracy that it dreams of. This, again, is a story for the Moscow Times, and it says that embarrassingly for the Kremlin, Russian AI isn't good enough for its own disinformation. Last Friday, OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, revealed the first confirmed use of generative AI as a tool of Russian disinformation. The campaigns the company disclosed, however, were not very effective, garnering merely hundreds of views and limited engagements across several platforms. But the most humiliating thing for Russia was not the campaign's lackluster returns, says the Moscow Times, but the fact they were reliant on American technology for them to function at all. Russia has invested heavily in its own AI chatbots, which until recently outperformed competitors in the Russian language. But when Russian operatives needed high-quality Russian content for semi-official government purposes and indeed for disinformation campaigns, they apparently looked to the American software to provide it. This episode reveals that despite increasingly dire talk from Russian leaders about the threats posed by foreign AI, Russia is indeed falling further behind, even where it concerns the Russian language. Russian leadership was amongst the first to recognize the revolutionary potential of AI, and Putin, I'm sure, is one of the first autocrats to realize how AI can be used to bolster autocracy and fight democracy. But Russia does not have the culture of technological innovation. It does not have the spirit of investment and indeed freedom that is required to build and evolve complex technologies like these. So whereas the article speculates about what Russia could potentially do next to try and close that gap between US technologies, even Chinese technologies, and Russian technology, I think this is a game they are going to lose, that are destined to lose, because their very model and structure of society, economics, politics does not lead to innovation and freedom. Now, here's a story that has caused considerable controversy. It's been shared by some experts, in fact, and touted as a good idea. I will read it out and I will let the audience decide whether this is a good idea or not. The Moscow Times says, let 3 million Russians come to Europe and take 500 billion euros out of Putin's pocket. For over 2 years, the West had been trying to block the inflow of money and high-tech goods to Russia, but has done nothing to stimulate the outflow of both financial resources and human capital. The article notes that, first of all, the war has not split Russian society. It has not provoked powerful anti-regime movements. Indeed, it has seriously boosted anti-Western sentiment inside Russia. Western authorities' policies, which have sought to support anti-war and anti-Putin Russians, appear understandable and notable, says the article, but are hardly capable of achieving serious change in Russian politics. Meanwhile, the war has prompted not just the emigration of thousands who strongly disagree with the regime, but also the departure of at least 1 million Russians, for whom the war is not something they oppose on ideological grounds. It's simply something that has prevented them from leading a normal life. And the article argues that the West, Europe in particular, should be looking to attract many millions of other Russians, qualified Russians with decent education who could earn their money abroad and whose ultimate aim is not political, but is just to lead a quiet and fulfilling personal life, professional life, enrich themselves monetarily, and not die in somebody else's war. These are not anti-war Russians, but the article is suggesting by attracting millions and millions of them, we could bleed the Putin regime of skilled workers, of resources, and finances. Now, there are some obvious problems with this way of thinking as well. We have seen in the last couple of months many, many murders and indeed intimidations of Ukrainians living in countries around Europe, but especially in Germany. If millions more Russians were to be let into the West, then that potential for friction, I think, would increase dramatically. But please do put your comments in the description of the video. I'd be absolutely fascinated to hear what you think. Now, I'm going to pop links to a couple of other articles that I think are fascinating into the description of the video. One is from the KYIV Post, and it's about a new Ukrainian Stalker sea drone, which has been unveiled in Odessa. It's the next innovation in Ukrainian marine warfare, and the article speculates about what we could see happen when these units are tested and scaled up and unleashed on the Russian Navy. It's an absolutely fascinating read. And lastly, an interesting article from NOVAYA, GAZETA again, which speculates that a lack of NATO resolve over Ukraine risks exposing Poland and the Baltic states to Moscow's next aggressive move. As Western leaders commemorated the 80th anniversary of D-Day on June the 6th, they should have kept in mind that just 5 years before the Allied landings that liberated Europe from fascism, the French socialist and future fascist politician Marcel Diaz had argued that French troops should not defend Poland against Nazi Germany. Fighting alongside our Polish friends for the common defense of our territories, our property, and our freedoms is a prospect we can courageously envisage. If it is to contribute to maintaining peace, he wrote in May 1939, but to die for Danzig? No, of course not. And this is an important idea because it's unlikely that Putin's next move will be a full-scale aggression against the NATO alliance. But salami slicing tactics, provocations, sabotage, assassinations, grey zone warfare, these aren't just things that Russia might consider. Sending arms, for instance, to proxies, enemies of the West, to attack bases on behalf of Russia. These aren't just theoretical threats. These are things that are happening right now. Indeed, if you're of a slightly more paranoid turn of mind, as of course I am in studying Russia and Putin, I suspect that he's been funding and implementing many of these tactics over the last 10 years or so. Today, many fear that if Vladimir Putin wins his war of aggression against Ukraine, countries like Poland and the Baltic states will be his next targets. Some even suggest that instead of waiting for Russian forces to reach these borders, these countries should preemptively send troops to Ukraine to force Russia to withdraw from all Ukrainian territory and keep Putin at bay. While such sentiments are not yet common in the West, some Western leaders are increasingly aware of the need for swift action, specifically the French President Emmanuel Macron, as we will have noted. It's important to say that very few people, including Ukrainians, while they might welcome his words, yet quite believe that there will be French troops on Ukrainian soil. And I don't think people can even vaguely imagine what those troops might end up doing if they were to be sent to Ukraine. But the lesson of history, the lesson of the Second World War, suggests that the longer we prevaricate, the longer we refrain from showing hard and willful force against Russia, then the more liberties Russia will take, the more seriously Putin will consider further aggression and weaponization of a variety of techniques to challenge the West. I think what's become clear in running this channel and doing the interviews is words mean nothing to Putin. Only actions, only force, and the exercise of will are things that gain his attention and have any deterrent power. We should urgently be considering everything we can deploy to deter Putin, argues this article, and I strongly encourage you to read it.